Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast. I'm Martin Jones.
And I'm John Paul Nevin. In this episode, we're talking to Dr Meaghan Beckner about the rapidly advancing world of biomarkers, a field that is already making great strides in the human performance space and has so much more to offer in the future.
Biomarkers are measures of biological indicators that reflect either physiological or pathological processes in the body. And these biomarkers can give us information about someone's general health status, their stress, metabolic function, or even recovery or adaptation to a stimuli.
We discuss how biomarkers can be used to monitor resilience and performance in high-stress, high-stakes environments.
When we have alterations in these growth or anabolic biomarkers, that could potentially be a good early warning sign of overtraining or monitoring physical readiness.
And explore the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to stress.
When we perceive a threat or a danger, that's what kicks in this stress response. Whether it's a true threat, such as coming face to face with a bear, or if it's a perceived threat like public speaking, your body doesn't necessarily know the difference, it just knows that there's a threat. The stress response is good and important, but we don't want to have stress where it's not needed. And how do we manage or control that?
Meaghan, welcome to the Optimising Human Performance podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm real good, thanks. I'm real good. So, Meaghan, could you give our listeners an insight into your backstory? Who you are, what you're currently doing, and how you've came into the role you're currently doing?
Sure. My undergraduate degree was in exercise science, and I knew I loved athletics and physical performance, but wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do with that. So after undergrad, I took a job to kind of figure out what I wanted to do, and I actually worked as a clinical research coordinator in emphysema and COPD research, looking at alternatives to lung volume reduction surgery, and learned a lot about the research process, but ultimately wanted to get back to applying that research process more into the athletic or performance realm. I went back to school for my PhD in rehabilitation science, and it was there that I became interested in the field of biomarkers. So one of the big studies we had going on was looking at resilience in military populations. So that ability to recover or resist or adapt from perturbations as a result of a challenge or a stressor. And that really intrigued me because I think a lot of people know it when they see it, but how to actually quantify that, whether it's through psychological measures or physiological measures, but how to really quantify that essence of resilience. So that's what really got me into trying to quantify that it factor, essentially, that resilience.
Excellent. Thank you, Meaghan. We've had a few people talk to us about resilience from different angles. I think resilience means 1,000 things to 1,000 different people. There's so many different definitions of what resilience is, maybe what resilience isn't. What's resilience for you? Can you help us understand what you mean when you say resilience?
Yeah, so I think for me in these military contexts, it's being able to encounter a stressor and overcome it. So certainly there is going to be that reaction or resist to stress, but those individuals that are able to push through or persevere through that stress and still maintain that high physical, cognitive, mental performance despite these external stressors or hurdles that they may encounter.
So, Meaghan, you mentioned biomarkers. So what is a biomarker and how can we potentially utilise them to monitor readiness?
So in general, biomarkers are measures of biological indicators that reflect either physiological or pathological processes in the body. So biomarkers can really come from a variety of sources, anything really that reflects physiology. So think of cardiology, a big one there is heart rate variability. It could be biomarkers from radiology, CT or X-ray. Even, how you walk or talk can technically be a biomarker. So if you're looking at gait signatures or pitch and tone of voice, all of these things can be biomarkers, but it's generally those molecular biomarkers or those biological samples or biofluids, so such as blood, urine, and saliva. And these biomarkers can give us information about someone's general health status, monitoring their stress and the load that has on their body, metabolic function, or even monitoring recovery or adaptation to a stimuli. So for example, in some of these really stressful environments, whether it's physical or mental stress, using biomarkers to monitor that stress, but also assess their recovery following that intense stress or stimuli.
So in terms of wearable technologies, I wear a smartwatch. The things that they are measuring, is that what we're talking about as well? They would equally be biomarkers?
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. So a lot of wearable devices now, you can get tons of information, but all of those things, yes, can be biomarkers. The molecular biomarkers are a bit more difficult because we have limited situations where we can get that information real time. For example, like your watch or your ring can give you real time information. That's one of the goals or future areas of molecular biomarkers, is be able to get to that real time reading.
And how far away do you think we are from that? Is this I'm going to put you on the spot early on. We're only a few minutes in. Is this something we're going to see soon, do you think?
I don't know if I can put a timeline in it, but I do know there are developing technologies that are being studied in animal models. So one example being the electrochemical aptamer-based sensors, or EAB sensors. So I don't know if we've quite jumped to ready for humans yet, but that is a very promising and I think much needed advancement to be able to get that. Certainly we have the glucose monitor that is very commonly used and that does provide that real-time feedback. But as far as some of these other biomarkers that can help us assess readiness or training status, hopefully soon, but I don't know if I have an answer for you there.
I don't need to replace my smartwatch quite yet. I
Not
can
yet,
wait for this fancy new technology for a few years.
Right.
Okay, it's good to know.
So Meaghan, you mentioned molecular biomarkers. So can you give us an insight into the types of molecular biomarkers you're referring to, and ones which are of particular interest when it comes to measuring maybe resilience, physiological resilience, or an individual's response to an external stressor?
Yeah, so there's certainly various types of biomarkers. I think for me personally, in kind of monitoring readiness or resilience, there's three broad categories, and those three would be neuroendocrine, inflammatory, and growth and anabolic. Neuroendocrine referring to that interaction between the nervous system and the endocrine system, which is involved with the stress response, hormonal regulation, and really just the overall homeostasis, or the ability to maintain a stable environment despite these external changes. The second, inflammatory biomarkers, those are a good reflection of inflammation or immune status. And those are typically tightly regulated in the absence of an infection. And those can be used, again, to monitor physiological or psychological strain or an adaptation to a stimuli. And the third being growth and anabolic biomarkers. These broadly would be biomarkers that promote growth, tissue repair, or that anabolic or building process in the body. And these can help with regulating anabolic balance, are sensitive to nutritional status. So when we have alterations in these growth or anabolic biomarkers, that could potentially be a good early warning sign of overtraining or monitoring physical readiness.
Very interesting.
And do those biomarkers come from blood, saliva? How do we actually measure these things in the real world?
So primarily blood, but some of these can also be measured in urine, which is nice for field studies.
Not nice for the researcher collecting the data, though.
Oh, yeah.
If it's windy, if it's particularly windy, it's terrible.
We'll take it anyway, but certainly the urine and saliva are easier in kind of these real world environments because blood would be ideal, but the setup, the needles, the collection, those are sometimes barriers to being able to collect in blood. So fortunately, yes, they are available in other biofluids such as saliva and urine.
Good. Now, we've got a fairly similar background. I also did sport and exercise science. Didn't know what to do either, but I ended up as a psychologist. So the molecules and all that kind of stuff used to keep me up at night. So I moved into psychology. But I'm interested in the neuroendocrine system and in particular and all these different things. And one that stands out, I get asked about a lot, is cortisol. And it seems to be this stress hormone that people talk about all the time. And you're trying to reduce cortisol, and cortisol is the enemy and all this kind of stuff. Now, it seems a bit simplistic to me as someone who is interested, but as a plucky amateur, shall we say, in these biomarkers. it feels like it's there for a reason, right? It's evolved for a reason. Are there any myths or anything around these biomarkers that you hear a lot that you maybe get wound up about that you want to dispel? For example, cortisol is to be removed at all costs.
Yeah, cortisol, I'm sure, is probably one of the most well-known. And to your point, it's important to remember that stress is not inherently bad. We don't want to not have a cortisol response because, like you said, it's very necessary. When we are in these fight or flight scenarios, we do want cortisol. We do want that release of fuel stores. We want that increased heart rate. All these things are good. It's just making sure that they are happening appropriately and that when the threat or the perceived threat's no longer there, that cortisol comes back down so we don't have chronic cortisol exposure. The stress response is good. Like you said, it's there for a reason. So that's probably the number one thing that people should take away, that stress is not bad, but it's just making sure that it's regulated.
So Meaghan, just going to go in a bit more depth, looking at cortisol particularly. Could you give our listeners an insight into the sympathetic nervous system and the stress response, in particular looking at activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis? Right, what's happening and what does elevated cortisol levels result in?
Right. Again, like at a high level, when we perceive a threat or a danger, that's what kicks in this stress response. So whether it's a true threat, such as coming face to face with a bear, or if it's a perceived threat like public speaking, your body doesn't necessarily know the difference. It just knows that there's a threat. So that really is what sets off this hormonal cascade. The response happens within seconds to minutes of that threat. It begins in the brain, and like you said, it's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which kind of refers to those 3 steps in the axis. So the stress signals the hypothalamus, which is located in the brain, to release a hormone that's called CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. And it travels to the pituitary gland, which sits at the base of your brain, and stimulates the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, into circulation. So once you have ACTH in circulation, it reaches the adrenal glands and it signals the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer of the adrenal gland, to secrete cortisol into circulation. And so that's what signals the energy stores to be broken down into glucose for energy, suppresses the immune system, and really kind of drives this fight or flight response. The HPA axis is very tightly controlled, so as you have an increase in cortisol concentrations, that is a negative feedback system, so it inhibits the CRH and ACTH production to ultimately then kind of slow or lower that signal cascade and gradually bring cortisol back into normal levels once that threat has subsided. So it happens within seconds to minutes, but then is also tightly controlled to keep itself in check to make sure that we don't have HPA overactivation.
If someone's exposed to a stressor for a continued length of time, can there be an adverse effect as a result?
Yeah, so like I said, when cortisol is released and you're breaking down these energy stores and you're suppressing the immune system, those things are beneficial short term for handling the stress, but if you're chronically having high cortisol levels, then that means you're chronically suppressing your immune system. And also you have what's called the HPG axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, which works in a similar way. It's a hormone signaling cascade that ultimately results in the release of testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. And so when you have HPA overactivation and a high cortisol release, that can suppress the HPG axis, which can lead to lower testosterone, lower estrogen levels, can impact recovery, again, getting at that growth anabolic domain. Certainly when the HPA axis is overactivated or chronically activated, it really has a kind of a cascading effect across immune growth and anabolic function.
So for those individuals that maybe are experiencing chronic stress, occupational stress, for example, you're in a job where you're just up against it, what do we do? I'm hoping the answer is you can come back down. I mean, how do we help these people?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly there are certain situations that are uncontrollable where you have limited control over the stress, but Keep in mind things like sleep and nutrition are also very important in helping keep your stress levels under control and the negative effects. So that HPG axis, testosterone, not part of the HPG axis, but insulin-like growth factor 1 is also important in growth and recovery. Those are very sensitive to nutritional status as well. So that's one thing that's pretty common in stressful environments. Sleep and nutrition also take a hit, but those things can also help with recovery or counteracting some of those stressful environments. So make sure that you're giving your body the best chance through sleep and nutrition.
Are there any particular biomarkers of resilience? So for example, if someone has an elevated level of a set biomarker, are they likely to be more resilient to some form of environmental stressor?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there have been some cases or some instances in research where there is promise that there might be biomarkers of resilience. There's two that I can think of off the top of my head. One being neuropeptide Y, which is released from sympathetic nerve endings in the peripheral nervous system that are released primarily in bursts during intense stress as a protective factor from the excessive stress-induced catecholamine release. So it has been reported that NPY or neuropeptide Y can also counteract hormones in the HPA axis that we were just talking about. And it's considered to have anxiety reducing effects. So there have been studies from the early 2000s that showed, for example, Special Forces soldiers had higher concentrations of NPY immediately following a mock interrogation compared to non-Special Forces soldiers. So the conclusion there was that maybe this is a positive psychological adaptation associated with the intense training that Special Forces soldiers endure. However, that hasn't been necessarily consistent through other studies. Neuropeptide Y hasn't come through the same way. So for example, I was involved with studies looking at BUDS, so U.S. Navy's Special Forces selection course, and we did not observe any changes in neuropeptide Y throughout that training. So neuropeptide Y is one that possibly could be, but it's not consistently shown in research studies. And then the other that we keep coming back to is cortisol. So there have been situations where higher cortisol prior to going through a Special Forces selection course increased the odds of making it through selection. But at the same time, there have been other studies that have shown that higher cortisol prior to a 10-day military winter training was associated with a greater likelihood of dropping out. So there are two studies that found higher cortisol was indicative of something. In one case, it was selection. In the other case, it was dropout. So a lot of it can also be context specific too. So to round out and answer your question, it's possible that there may be some biomarkers of resilience, but the debate is still out there.
Can we use these biomarkers as a selection criterion? For example, I'm wondering whether instead of does the arduous training change these biomarkers, I'm assuming there's some kind of genetic component and perhaps somebody has just got the greater potential to clear it quicker or to generate this particular hormone or whatever it is. What are your thoughts on that? Can we use biomarkers to select people, or is it just too noisy at this stage?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's too noisy at this stage. Certainly they can be a tool to help assess and monitor, but I don't think we're there yet to use biomarkers as a binary yes, no, you're in, you're out. I just don't think we're there yet. Certainly a helpful tool, but not a standalone selection criteria.
If I remember correctly, from Andy Morgan's work, I think he identified DHEA.
Yeah, so that's another one that's studied a lot. DHEA stands for dehydroepiandrosterone. It's a long one, but it's a precursor to testosterone that can help assess adrenal fatigue. So it kind of modulates the effects of cortisol by providing neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory effects. So a lot of times in research, you see both DHEA and cortisol studied together or independently, but also as a ratio, because it's kind of a general measure of that balance between the anabolic and the catabolic processes in the body. So, if your DHA to cortisol ratio is high, that would indicate that you're maybe more in an anabolic state or able to keep your cortisol in check. If your DHA to cortisol ratio is very low, that would indicate that cortisol is very high and maybe there's more catabolic activity going on, which may be indicative of a more stressful state in the body. But yeah, that's another one that's often measured a lot as a kind of a marker of resilient or resilient adjacent.
So Meaghan, just going on that one a bit further, so if we were working with a group of individuals and we were undertaking a structured training intervention, could we potentially utilise that DHEA cortisol ratio as a weekly biomarker to get a bead as to an individual's conditional training readiness? So for example, if they had elevated cortisol levels, and obviously we're trying to apply a training prescription to enhance positive adaptation, but if someone's catabolic, hopefully we're going to change something, we're going to wind it back before pushing forward again.
Yeah. I think that would be a good, quick check or assessment to monitor that training effect. The one caveat would be when you are measuring it, you want to make sure that if it is, for example, weekly, that it's measured under the same conditions. So first thing in the morning, after a night of rest, or making sure that anything that immediately precedes the collection wouldn't be interfering with your readings that would maybe falsely indicate heightened stress when it may have just been right after a workout or something.
For that marker, can it be taken from saliva or does it have to be blood?
It can be saliva. I know there have been some studies that have looked at it in saliva, so that also helps expedite the collection process.
And easier if you've got participants who dribble a lot. In certain selection courses I've seen, you get a lot of dribblers, so much easier, much easier.
Meaghan, you mentioned the work which you've done around the impact of arduous selection courses such as BUDS. Mm-hmm. Can you give us an insight into how such a course affects an individual physiologically? Obviously, it's not going to be a pleasant experience, and that's part of the party, but how's it going to impact upon them physiologically?
Yeah. So during my PhD program, I was fortunate enough to be involved with a study looking at both the physiological and psychological resilience across BUDS. So for those that may be less familiar, BUDS stands for U.S. Navy's Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training, SEAL standing for Sea, Air, and Land. And this is the initial assessment and selection course for Navy's Special Operation Forces. It's about 28 weeks and it's extremely difficult. The dropout rate is anywhere from 65 to 80% of a class drops out at some point over those 28 weeks. It's divided kind of 3 phases, and prior to that first phase, you have basic orientation so that there is some training evolutions during that time, but you really get into the thick of it with the start of phase 1, which is 8 weeks that is dedicated to the physiological or physical conditioning, with the 4th week there being called Hell Week because it's one of the most notorious, arduous periods of the entire training and has one of the highest dropout rates for any single week in BUD. So that's a big milestone, is getting through Hell Week. And then phase 2 is another 8 weeks of combat diving. Phase 3, 8 weeks dedicated to weapons and demolition. But as you can imagine, it is extremely physically demanding, mentally demanding. They're having to do very intense training every week, and they're expected to complete physical standards in faster times as the training progresses. So they're constantly being physically challenged. Some of the work that I was involved with assessing BUDS, we wanted to see first if successful completion of that first phase, those 8 weeks dedicated to physical conditioning, is successful completion of that first phase related to either psychological measures of resilience, physiological biomarkers of resilience, or the sum of both physiological and psychological. And those candidates that remained enrolled after the first phase, they had both higher concentrations of DHEA and a higher ratio of DHEA to cortisol, like we were talking about, that balance between anabolic and catabolic processes. And when we looked at across the entire BUDS training course for the physiological resilience, we actually observed that there was steady increase in DHEA concentrations and in the DHEA to cortisol ratio. However, there was considerable between subject variability, but that may suggest that this progressive, intensive physical training during BUDS may have contributed to that anabolic response, as evidenced by the small but steady increases in DHEA and DHA to cortisol ratio. So there may be an adaptive response that happens there with that repeated stress over those 28 weeks.
So am I right in thinking that DHEA, you can actually buy it as a supplement? Is that a good idea? Does it pass the blood-brain barrier? Is it the same thing? If I'm going to go and buy some, am I just wasting my money? I mean, what does it do?
Admittedly, I don't know too much about the supplement side, but I'm always hesitant, if you want to add exogenous DHEA supplement, because that may kind of mess with your body's natural ability to generate and produce those hormones, which then can throw off your natural signaling to generate those things on your own.
Good. I'm glad you said that, because I'm no expert on this stuff, but I'm always a little bit concerned when people go out buying these things.
Meaghan, you mentioned obviously Hell Week on buds. Have you read Andrea Uphill's paper looking at the physiological consequences of the Special Forces selection for the Australian Army? I don't know if you've had eyes on that paper yet.
No, I haven't, but I will have to check it out.
The reason I mention it is we were chatting to Greg Half, and he was part of the team doing it. And essentially, they had this 19-day selection course. And the first 9 days it looks fun. That's the best way to describe it. But one of the things that they identified was the energy deficit. So they identified that they were having energy expenditure over that period at the beginning of almost 7,500 calories.
Wow.
And they were only consuming around 3,000. So obviously they were in a huge calorific deficit. But what they found come the end of it, physiologically, obviously people were losing a lot of mass. It was having a massive adverse effect on their hormonal balance, funny enough. Testosterone, cortisol ratios and various other catabolic hormones were elevated. But sort of expanding on that, obviously I appreciate a lot of work's been done with other arduous courses. So like looking at the summation, I'm sort of referring back to the review paper you published a couple of years ago. When we pull all these things in, what do you see? What are we seeing when people do these arduous courses? What sort of impact is it going to have on them?
Yeah, so I think the number one that you mentioned was this energy deficit that occurs just when there's a high energy output that's not matched by energy intake. And that really has an effect on those growth and anabolic hormones, where testosterone can really drop significantly, insulin like growth factor 1, more so for females, progesterone and estrogen, which can really limit the ability for the body to recover and attenuate those losses, specifically in lean body mass, that occur and ultimately have a negative impact on performance. Certainly that's accompanied by a pretty significant inflammatory or immune response. So you see a big increase in pro-inflammatory biomarkers, systemic stress, compromised immunity, because again, coming back to the growth and anabolic, you're not able to recover or attenuate those losses. And then with cortisol, typically those neuroendocrine biomarkers, cortisol's through the roof, which suppresses the HPG axis. The neuropeptide Y, in some instances, you see an increase in attempt to mitigate that stress response. In other cases, there may be a decrease, just not able to keep up. But as you can see, they're all very interconnected, so they really depend on one another. So those systems are very intertwined, and when you're in a stressful environment like that, it really has a cascading impact across those domains.
It sounds to me like these longer term arduous courses cause these physiological perturbations, but they also withhold recovery, that you're never able to get back down to baseline because you can never eat enough, you can never sleep enough, you just can't get back to baseline. If somebody has got a bit more control over their environment, maybe they're not on an arduous course, they're just in a high stress job, but they do have time and resource to recover. If we've sorted their nutrition, they're able to get their sleep. Is there anything else? Do we need to do anything else to accelerate that recovery? Or is it equally, is there anything that people often do that's probably worthless? I'm thinking ice baths, but you don't have to go. You can. Yeah. People love ice baths.
Yeah, I think the one thing that comes to mind coming out of these arduous courses where there is a significant loss of lean body mass, some may have the notion to just get in the gym and try to get back all that strength as soon as possible, and they're really not doing themselves any favors, because
I think it's called op-massive. I think it's the term that people call it.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
But that can just perpetuate or prolong that stress or that inability to recover, allowing your body time to rest, time to recover before trying to get back in and regain those lost strength gains. I think that would be the biggest thing, is that notion to just get back in the gym that may actually hinder your ability to recover.
And what do you think of ice baths? Are they going to help? This is my hand grenade question to you, because people ask me about ice baths all the time and I'm not sure about them.
I'll be honest, I'm not as up to date, but I know there have been some back and forth whether, icing is good or if it limits the natural inflammatory healing process. So I don't know what the final verdict is there. Anecdotally, I will say they make me feel better, but I really don't know if there's really any science or truth to that.
I put you on the spot there, Meaghan. I apologise.
Okay.
I think there's been a bit in professional sport looking at almost periodising the use of ice baths. So if you're in training and you're trying to drive an inflammatory response for adaptation, no, you're not getting an ice bath, suck it up.
Right.
Whereas if you're in competition and you want to try and maintain performance and reduce an inflammatory response between competition, get in the ice bath. So I think there's been some interesting work around there. Meaghan, Martin's going to laugh because I've been pretty much throwing this in every episode this season.
Here we go.
What's your thoughts on the idea of stress inoculation training? So if we expose someone to a stressor and we grade that stressor over time and we overlay that with some psychological skills, just to keep Martin happy, can we enhance resilience? Can we expect to see physiological changes? Could we track those potential changes in resilience using biomarkers?
It's a good question. I think definitely there's potential there. Coming back to the same principles as strength and conditioning, so progressive overload or gradually increasing the demands placed on the body, whether that's the physical demands or the mental demands. I think it goes back to the initiation of the stress response. It kicks in whether the stress is real or perceived. So if you gradually increase exposure to these environmental extremes or these stressful situations, maybe you can manage that perceived threat aspect and manage your response accordingly. To be clear, the stress response is a good thing. We want the stress response, but we also want to make sure it's in check. So if you encounter a stressful scenario that first time, you may have like kind of over HPA response that maybe is too much. And with that gradual overload or progressively practicing that exposure, that you can bring that stress response down to an appropriate level, or just kind of be better prepared physically and mentally to handle that situation when you encounter it.
You've done it now, Meaghan. You've told him that's a good question. We're going to get stress inoculation questions every episode now. Thanks for that.
No problem. Yeah.
There's a term that's thrown around in the biomarkers literature that I've come across. It's this omics. Can you help us understand what omics means and what are the different types? Why is it important that we need to know what they are?
Sure, yeah. So omics collectively refers to the study of a particular biological component or process on a global scale. So everything we've been talking up to this point has primarily been hormones or part of the endocrine response. Omics gets kind of at those more basic levels. So for example, genomics, that's the study of an organism's complete set of genes and their interaction with an organism. So typically, your genes are what they are, and how do they interact within a person. The next kind of level up from the basic genomics would be transcriptomics. So that is what appears to be happening in the body. It's the complete set of RNA transcripts produced by cells, and that provides insight in how genes are regulated and how they respond to different conditions. So there's kind of this layering. So genomics is kind of the foundation that transcriptomics builds upon. After transcriptomics, then you kind of get at the level of proteomics. So that's an entire set of proteins produced by an organism to help understand protein functions, interactions, and modifications. And from proteomics, then kind of the next level up, getting closer to hormones, but not hormones, metabolomics. So that's the study of small molecules in cells, tissues, or biological fluids that provide information on the metabolic pathways occurring within an organism. during a given physiological state. So that could be comparing the metabolic pathways prior to some intense training and then how those metabolic pathways change in response to the intense demands placed on the body. So collectively, omics can provide additional insight into these underlying mechanisms of these physiological processes that typically are more targeted or specific and individualized to a person. So maybe getting at more specific biological signatures of an individual under either normal biological processes or in response to a stressor or a stimuli.
I remember doing Western blots a long time ago and thinking it was a dark art and couldn't quite work out what was going on. And I now see through different people who work in this area, it seems to be computationally quite extreme. Mm-hmm. Is this a technology that is quite prohibitive? Do you have to have a quite advanced computational skills, mathematical knowledge to understand this data, or do you think it's something that Joe Average would be able to understand?
For me personally, it was a very steep learning curve, but there have been tools that help bridge that gap, especially from the computational aspect, like you were mentioning. So I've done some work with metabolomics, and there is kind of an online platform called MetaboAnalyst that you can essentially load in your metabolomics data, which is a huge data set. But once you're in MetaboAnalyst, it's very point and click and kind of walks you through the different types of analyses you can do. So I think there is certainly efforts to help bridge that gap between your geneticist and, like you said, your average Joe, to create a platform or an interface that is more digestible and low barrier to entry for people, like myself, that had no prior experience with omics and being able to navigate and analyze.
I think that's valuable to hear. There's certain genetics companies, isn't there, that take a cheek swab and then can predict everything about you, apparently, if you believe the marketing claims. I feel like it seems too simple. They probably can't. And I know there's a couple of companies currently going into bankruptcy kind of as we speak right now.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about those big genetic companies that take a sample and then predict your caffeine metabolism or your ACE gene, whether you're going to be an endurance runner or a sprinter? Is that worthwhile, do you think, or is there anything that's potentially harmful with that sort of approach?
There could potentially be some harm or concern as taking that information as absolute and, there's nothing you can do about it. Those are your genes. I think that would be not maybe the right way to go about interpreting that. You mentioned about caffeine metabolism. I haven't been following up on it, but I know there's a researcher in Canada that has looked at that more for sports performance, because caffeine can be an ergogenic aid, but for some people that cannot metabolize caffeine as well as others, that it may actually have the opposite effect and may not help their performance or potentially hinder their performance. So
it just makes me want to sit in a cafe all day and read a paper in a cafe.
Yeah, you might be one of them. So that's just one example where maybe that would be helpful information to have, because then you can use caffeine appropriately. If you find that it's not helping you, then you can find other ways to prepare yourself for physical performance. But I don't think it's the end all be all. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. So like you just said, you have caffeine, you know how it affects you. People can have caffeine and then decide for themselves if it helps or hurts their training. So again, I think it's another one of those things that's a great tool and a great asset, but I don't think should be taken in absolute terms.
Meaghan, in addition to omics, is there any other areas of interest in regards to the future direction of biomarkers?
Yeah, so for me personally, as part of my PhD dissertation, started getting into extracellular vesicles as another potential biomarker. So extracellular vesicles, or EVs, have recently emerged as a pivotal means of cell-to-cell communication, whether it's for normal physiological processes such as tissue repair or immune regulation, but also in the pathology of several diseases. EVs are membrane-bound vesicles that are released by nearly all cell types and can be isolated from a variety of biofluids. And what's unique about EVs is they are considered a comprehensive package of biological content that are protected by this lipid bilayer in transport. So in circulation between cells, that content or cargo within the EVs is protected. And they can also cross the blood-brain barrier, which is not the case for a lot of circulating biomarkers, but EVs do have that ability. And so that EV cargo, whether it's proteins, microRNA, metabolites, the contents within those EVs hold a lot of promise for either predictive, diagnostic, or therapeutic capabilities that are being investigated across many disciplines. So I think there's a lot of promise there. There's still a lot of unknowns with EVs that we need to further explore. But the fact that it's kind of this packaged cargo that's protected, I think there's a lot of promise there in exploring the utility of EVs.
Interesting, very interesting.
Meaghan, I know you've done some research around pre-workouts and supplementation for pre-workouts. What are your thoughts on using pre-workouts to improve performance?
So again, my personal approach is I really don't use pre-workout supplements. Admittedly, I will have a cup of coffee probably before I work out, but personal preference, try to steer away from those. I think in general, if people do decide to use pre-workout supplements, really make sure you know what ingredients are in it. They can be third-party tested to make sure that it is what it says it is on the label. But yes, I have published some work in multi-ingredient pre-workout supplements, or MIPS. And we did see a slight benefit with pre-workout supplements. But again, I think it was in the single digits of a percentage that we saw that improvement. So I think for your average Joe, maybe you're not going to get a huge improvement. If 3 to 5% is meaningful to you, then maybe it's worth a try. But from the research that I was involved with, any benefit was small at best. So I guess I'll leave that up to the individual to decide if that's worth it. But I would say the biggest thing is to make sure you know what's in the pre-workout that you are taking.
Yeah, maybe save your money. Not necessarily going to get the effect that people think they are.
That would be my personal recommendation.
Yeah, good. I'm glad to hear that. Are there any substances in these workout compounds that we should avoid based on the work that you've done? Again, caffeine obviously is probably the main active ingredient. What other active ingredients should be avoided or maybe not working in the way that people expect them to?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with a vast number of the ingredients, but beta-alanine is one that some people really think they get a benefit from, but others may kind of have a adverse reaction, might feel really itchy or almost sick to their stomach sometimes. So maybe be careful, start with small doses and see how your body responds. But certainly, some of these I think have very high levels of caffeine, which is also not good either. So certainly everything in moderation.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. We've been speaking for quite a while. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. What we like to do towards the end of the episode is to hand it back over to you to close things up. This can be something that you want to talk about that you maybe haven't mentioned yet. It could be something you want to reiterate or reinforce that you feel is particularly important. So how would you like to close for us?
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed this conversation as well. I think 2 key take-home messages that summarize a lot of what we talked about. Number 1 being that stress is not inherently bad, that the stress response is good and important. It's just a matter of measuring it and understanding that it has its place, but we don't want to have stress where it's not needed. And how do we manage or control that? And second, that biomarkers can be a great tool. They can really complement psychological measures and having the physiological assessment as well to complement or training load, their actual physical performance output. But I want to reiterate, I don't think we're there yet that they can work in isolation or be the end-all be-all. I think a lot of this is very context-specific and certainly an aid, but not an outright selection criteria by any means.
That's great. Thank you very much. And if anyone wants to follow you, read your research, see what you're up to, what's the best way of them doing that?
Yeah, I would say probably the 2 best ways would be find me on ResearchGate or LinkedIn.
Great. We can get those links into the show notes so people can find you.
Sounds good.
Great. Meaghan, again, thank you very much. Really enjoyed this. Thanks for your time. Have a great evening.
All right. Thank you.
Great discussion. Cheers, bud.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in. And if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, Keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.